My name is Joshua Keith, and this is theburningcoal.com, a website dedicated to God's glory, His grace, and our response to it. Today we're going to start looking at the book of 1 Peter. This is a study that I want us to do over the next few weeks in these longer sessions. And to get started, we're going to take a look at an introduction of the book. We're going to look at the who, the what, the where, the why. And I always suggest that whenever you start studying a new book, that you take some time to answer these questions. Now, some of these, there are different resources you can take a look at that help provide information, again, on the who, the what, the where. It's good to get a little bit different ideas. So, for example, we're going to talk about a few cities. Where are those cities that Peter is writing to? Does that matter to us in any way? There's a lot of good resources for that. But one of the things that we want to do in the very beginning of a study is actually just read through the book as much as we can in one sitting or in two sittings so that you get a general idea. One of the reasons why these introductions are so important is because when we start studying a book, we may start diving into the first few verses. We may take a look at verses 1, 2, and 3, and we spend 3 or 4 hours studying what those terms mean, how Peter's trying to use them, and because of that, we may miss the forest for the trees. And so before you start going in and doing the deep dive into the individual verses, which is always a very important and beneficial study, it's good to step out, look at the big picture. If you're going to be joining us, I would invite you to do the same. Go ahead, take the book of Peter, and read it in one sitting if at all possible. So again, you can get an idea of some of the themes, the what, and maybe even get a little bit of the why, because that's going to help you whenever you're trying to understand individual passages. So let's get started by taking a look at who wrote the book. So the book was written by the Apostle Peter. Now, anytime you go and you look in particularly at scholarly resources and the study of books asking who wrote them, you're going to see that there's a lot more debate than you might expect at first. You might think that, well, it's named 1 Peter. Obviously, Peter wrote it. And that is very much true. However, there are people who don't believe in the Bible who make arguments that it really wasn't written by Peter, but instead by another author who was pretending to be Peter because that would lend them the authority that Peter had. When we go through and we take a look at those arguments, and again, there are a lot of resources out there to discuss that. We're not going to be focusing on that so much in our study, but it is pretty obvious to me that this was written by the Apostle Peter, and we can take it as such. Now, just as a reminder, some of the background of Peter is going to be helpful in our study as well. First of all, Peter was chosen by Christ. We see a couple of different times where Jesus and Peter interact, even before we have this limited commission here in Matthew chapter 10, verse 2, where Peter is one of the 12 that is chosen by Jesus to be one of his close disciples. And even among those 12, as we go through the Gospels, we see a common theme that Peter was one of Jesus' closest companions. For example, in Matthew chapter 17, we see the transfiguration where Jesus takes his closest companions up to the mountains. And when he's up there, we see that Elijah and Moses start talking to Jesus. And Jesus, his own image is changed. He looks to be bright and shining. And so that's why we call it the transfiguration. Well, we see that not everybody had access to this meeting, but Jesus only invited 3 people, Peter, James, and John. And so Peter and James and John, they are oftentimes made into a separate, smaller group that goes and spends times with Jesus. Again, when Jesus goes to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, he takes Peter, James, and John with him. And so we see that Peter had a very close relationship with Jesus, and that Jesus really appreciated Peter and loved Peter and spent time with Peter. If we're not careful, we may take a look at Peter and we see the Gospels and we just see all of Peter's flaws. But Peter is one of the people that Jesus in the flesh, God in the flesh, wanted to spend the most time with. And it is for that reason, I think, that we see that Peter then becomes an apostle and a leader of the church. So even with all of his flaws, he was chosen by God to be somebody who would lead the church as it was beginning. In Acts chapter 2, we have the day of Pentecost. And while all the disciples are there preaching, we see that Peter is the one who is mentioned by name. And time again in the first few chapters of Acts, it's Peter who is taking the lead. Peter who is first and foremost in the church as it's starting. And so Peter is somebody that would have a lot of authority to these Christians. They would have known of his works. They would have known of his acts as an apostle. You're going to see, as we talk about the where, that it may be that some of these Christians were actually there and heard Peter preach at the day of Pentecost. And so you can imagine how excited the Christians would have been to hear the words of Peter, the encouragements from Peter. So Peter then wrote the book. Let's take a look at the where. So where was Peter when he wrote it? So in 1 Peter 5:13, it talks about Peter being in Babylon. Now, there is questions about what does he mean by the term Babylon. Does he mean the actual Babylon where the Jews were taken into captivity? Or could it be that he was referring to Rome? It's probably most likely Rome. We see that Babylon would have made a sense as a type and antitype with the idea of the earthly kingdom set opposed to God's kingdom. You see that Babylon is the one who came and looted the temple, the one who put God's people into captivity, who made them exiles, which is going to be an important term as we go through this book. And so Babylon then is the one that is against God's people. And so it makes sense that with Rome being against God's people, the Roman Empire going against the Christians, that Peter would refer to Rome where he was. We know from sources historically that he spent time at the end of his life in Rome. So it makes sense that he was referring to it this way to help the Christians of that time understand the bigger stakes of the battle that they were in. As far as when it was written, with these books, it's hard to pinpoint dates specifically, but we think it was probably between 62 and 64 AD. So just to put this into context, what do those numbers mean? That's probably about 30 years after the church started. So it's been a while since the church has been here. Peter's getting closer to the end of his life. He may know that that's coming. Jesus had told him that he would be persecuted to the point of death. And so we see that the church has been able to grow in this time. It has spread over many places, even getting to the capital of the known world at that time, the city of Rome. So we see that it was written by Peter, probably with him being in Rome around 30 years after the church had started, after it had grown. So who was it to? So Peter talks about these different areas: Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. These are the areas that he is expecting this letter to go to and encourage. And these areas are important for us to know because they would have been the major trade and travel areas of Asia Minor, or what we would normally refer to today as Turkey. And so what's valuable about understanding this is that this really is a general letter. Compare this to what Paul does with the letter to the Corinthians. He was talking about very specific questions that the Corinthian church had asked. He was talking about very specific issues he had heard about with that church. Peter instead is writing a letter to a large group of people, and he's wanting to talk about things from a general perspective, wanting to encourage them from a general perspective. And what he's hoping is that this is going to go hit these churches in this major travel area. It will be easy for the letter to go to these areas because of the travel. But not only that, he's hoping that it will also be copied and taken to the surrounding areas so that the churches near these major ports and travel areas would be encouraged by the letter as well. Now, unlike the book of Hebrews, we don't see that it's just one specific audience. We see that we are looking at both Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. Now, we notice the idea of dispersion in the greeting as well. And I think this was not an accident that Peter said it this way, because you do see that there were probably some Christians from Pentecost. Some of the same areas that Peter mentions here in the beginning of 1 Peter are also areas where Jews had come from for the day of Pentecost. And if you remember, after Pentecost happens, the church starts and people stay in the area of Jerusalem for quite a while. And so these Christians from this area were here. They get to see the start of the church. They get to listen to the preaching from Peter and from the other apostles. They get to see all these miracles. But then when we get to chapter 8, we see that the church comes under persecution, most notably by Saul of Tarsus. And because of that persecution, they then scatter. They disperse. And so it's interesting that Peter refers to these Christians as the dispersion, because I do think that he's talking about the suffering that has happened to the church continuously. It's the suffering that happened to the church in Jerusalem, but also to the churches as they grew in these other areas. They also maintained a difficult relationship with those people around them. The Jewish leaders in Thessalonica, for example, were always trying to chase the Christians out, trying to persecute the church. And so there would have been Christians dispersing from many areas. However, he also talks about Gentile Christians. You notice in 1 Peter 4, 3 through 4, he talks about some of the things that the Gentiles do, and that they wonder why you don't still do them anymore. And it seems that he's talking about, in this context of 1 Peter 4, 3 through 4, that those Christians are coming from a Gentile background, and now they too are being viewed as different from those around them. And they're not going to do the same things that they used to do as Gentiles, because they're not just Gentiles anymore. Now they're Christians. They have come into a relationship with Christ. And so they're going to put away that old life. And again, in that context, it makes sense that he's talking to the Gentile Christians more so than the Jewish Christians, which would have had different difficulties. Overall, again, we see that in these areas, this is a very general epistle meant to go to lots of different places, and it's meant to talk to lots of different Christians, both Jews and Gentiles. So what was it that Peter wanted to say to them? What is the book about? Well, there's really three themes that we see, and we can see them at the very beginning of chapter 1. And actually, two of those themes come up in the very first verse. In 1 Peter 1:1, when he's addressing the people, he calls them the elect exiles of the dispersion. So first of all, we are elect to God. This is going to be a theme throughout the book, that we are chosen, that God specified us as his chosen people. However, that does not mean that things are going to be easy. That does not mean that God is now going to give us these amazing physical blessings, that the world is going to acknowledge us as God's people and are going to defer to us in the things that are happening. In fact, the next word is the idea of exiles. So while we are elect to God, to the world, we are exiles. This world is not our home. We are searching for a better, a heavenly country, as the Hebrew author puts it. And so we are out of place on earth. And that's important for us to understand. And that's something that Peter wants them to know and to understand. And so this dichotomy is something that is to warn them, but also to give them comfort. That it's okay that you are exiles in the world. It's okay that the world does not want you, because God has chosen you. But if you're going to be one of God's elect, then you need to live accordingly. Be holy, for I am holy. And so we need to live as the elect of God, and we need to not lose faith. And so we can see then what the book is about really leads easily into why was it written. I think the best theme verse for 1 Peter is going to be chapter 4, verse 19. It says, "Therefore let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good." So we see a few different things here. First of all, we see that suffering is something that's coming. And really, this is what it means to be in exile. We need to understand that our rejection from the world is going to be something that is painful. That's what happened to the Jews that became Christians in Jerusalem. That's why they were dispersed. They were exiles. But it's also what happens to the Gentiles as well. As Peter is going to talk about a few different times, they are going to reject you because you no longer do what you used to do. And yes, it will come to the point of suffering. You being in exile doesn't just stop with being ignored. At a certain point, it will involve persecution as well. And so, you need to understand that you're going to suffer. But that's okay. Why? Because you are following God who has chosen you. And it's interesting, it says this idea of according to God's will, entrust their soul to a faithful Creator. So you need to understand that you have been chosen by God, and He is a faithful Creator. He is the one who created you. He is the one who gave you life. He's also the one that can give you new life in a new heaven and a new earth. And so when you are trusting the Creator, you can allow the suffering to happen. You can stand strong during it because you follow a faithful Creator. And so that allows us to entrust our souls, to live in faith, that it's worth it to give up those things of the old life. It's worth it to go through persecution. And we should not stop because we know that our God will reward us. And we need to continue to do good. We need to continue to be holy, to live in the good works that God has created for us. Because that's why He created us anew, so we could do these things. And so this book was meant to be such an encouragement for those Christians as they were about to go through the difficulties that they were going to encounter. It's good for us to study it as well. This is going to be something that I think is very valuable for us to go through, because it's going to let us see those same lessons as we suffer for the cause of Christ, as we feel like exiles, as we feel like people that even in our own homeland are foreigners. It's okay, because we have entrusted our souls to a faithful Creator. So we will continue to do good. we're going to be able to learn the exact same lessons that those Christians needed, because we need them as well. So I look forward to looking a little bit deeper into 1 Peter and diving even more into these specific lessons. I hope that this lesson blesses you in your walk in His kingdom.